Hello, my name is Roman Djindjihashvili, and this video is about importance of a pawn structure, something we already had, but in completely different aspect. We talk about going for worse pawn structure in exchange for some other benefits in position, such as maybe king-side attack or queen-side attack, or maybe for some other dynamic activities. So we are not going to be touching the material subject. So like not getting pawn structure for a piece, for extra pawn, but strictly based on position. So sometimes you do want to go for attack. You want to attack your opponent. But it doesn't always happen that you can do that without making any damages in your position. And sometimes you create weaknesses, maybe even sacrifice a pawn. But we're going to be talking about when is it worth to making sacrifice in a pawn structure to get some other positional advantages. So first I want to bring you several games when one side has some positional deficit in a form of a pawn structure, and what do they get for it. And I want to start with a couple of examples of exact same pawn structure, exact same opening, and two absolutely conflicting results. And you see how one tiny move order can make huge difference. We're talking about accelerated Draken, something I covered many times before. Knight f3, g6, d4, one of the main positions of accelerated Draken. Bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, bishop c4, queen a5. And again, I want to mention, I'm not going to go into details of theoretical discussions. No. We talk about, you should concentrate on this video strictly on the pawn structure. d6, h3, and now bishop d7, queen d3 is one of the main moves, rook fc8, and this position happened multiple times. I want you to see a difference between move a3 and the rook fe1. Now, it looks like it shouldn't be big difference between these. a3 is a good, useful move to stop in the future black knight going to b4, or maybe even after a6 and b5 black plays to stop b4. So in general, it's a useful move. But here you're going to see a huge difference between them. Now, black can go knight e5, and after queen e2, black will make the best move in this position. Actually, I played this position a couple of times myself. That move that looks like disastrous, terrible move, highly anti-positional, and absolutely unsound. Queen a6 move. And you see this pawn structure. It looks terrible for black. But in reality, this is a good position for black. In fact, it's very good position for black. Actually, I think black has some advantage. Now, how can this double A pawn, okay, it's not just double pawn, it's a double pawn on the A file, which makes it even worse, and totally isolated. That means no other pawn on B file. So it looks like this pawn's doomed, and position looks horrible for black. What does black have here? Black have great dynamics of play, such as rook b8, knight c4, and maybe even pushing A pawns. They have kind of attack on the counterplay on C and B files, which fully compensate structural damage. Now, white, on the other hand, if they manage harmlessly to exchange pieces, they're going to have big, maybe winning positional advantage. So, how should we evaluate this position? Queen takes a6, b8, and now probably the best move, rook f to d1. You need the A rook to maybe protect the b2 pawn, which you will see why. Okay, after rook f to d1, knight c4. Now, the best move is bishop takes c4, rook takes c4. I want you to see why black has tremendous compensation. Rook a to b1. Now, knight b3 is not possible because e4 pawn is hanging. So, rook a to b1, white 100% safe because those pawns are not under immediate danger. But what black has here, they have long time pressure. And for example, the exchange sacrifice here is not very good for black because white will have an advantage here. Rook c7 and eventually their knight b3, and black does not have enough compensation for exchange. But they are not intending to, so rook b8. And now white wants to prepare to go knight b3, so they protect the e4 pawn by playing f3. Now we want to retreat that rook from c4. It's done its job. Rook c7. We are planning to double rooks on b file. And after rook c7, knight b3. Those are the best defensive moves for white. We cannot go through every move because position, it doesn't have concrete character of the position. There is no concrete threats to white. So this is like a covering the b file, opening bishop and rook, and in general, this is a move that makes a lot of sense. Bishop e6. Now, suppose knight d4, and should black go back bishop d7? No, because black has an advantage here, and the move is knight d7. Now, after knight d7, black is going knight e5 and knight c4. Knight takes e6, f takes e, and bishop d2. Black suffered more damages to their pawn structure as their advantage increased. Now, this is really a bad position for white. Now, you see, we have, of course, the double e pawn is not nearly as bad as double a pawn because double e pawn is a part of a e7, e6, and d6 pawns, so they may work together. But double a pawn has almost no explanation except for a great dynamic play that pays off for black. After bishop d2, black has very big advantage by playing knight b6. Knight is going to c4, and white cannot stop it because b3 cannot be played because knight on c3 is hanging. That's why we didn't play knight e5, because white may go b3. Bishop is blocked on g7. So we go knight b6. Now suppose king f2. Now we go knight c4. And you see we start creeping up on white queenside pawns. After knight c4, knight a4, protecting everything. It looks like they're still safe. Knight a4, but now we go rook c to b7. Attacking b2 pawn, which cannot be protected, and b3 cannot be pushed because of knight takes a3. So after rook b7, c3, and now black has a comfortable choice. You see, white couldn't manage to defend queenside pawns. And actually, I looked at this variation in many different ways. There is no way to defend successfully the queenside. Although the queens are off the board, and still the counterplay and dynamics of the pieces are overwhelming. Now black can go knight takes b2, they can play knight takes a3 and have an advantage, but rook b3 is the best move, maintaining all those threats and also isolating completely knight on b3. Now there may be a possibility of playing rook b5 followed by rook a5 and winning the knights. All black's pieces completely dominating here, and there is a result of bad double pawn on a file. Piece dynamics and play make this position very, very powerful for black. But originally, once we got this position, we just exchanged queens. And it does look like white should be able to defend their queen side, and white should be okay, but they couldn't make it. Now let's look at the same position with a slight difference. Here, queen d3, rook c8, and now suppose rook f to e1. Knight e5, queen e2, and queen a6. Queen takes a6, b takes a, and you'll see the same position. Instead of a3, white played rook f to e1. That's a dramatic difference. Well, as I said, this was close, the last game we saw. The position was close for evaluations, and it was very hard to determine who really was better until it came too obvious. Well, in this position, I don't know if black can play any better than the game was played. However, they didn't do that well. Now, after exchange of queens, white plays rook a to d1, knight c4, and bishop c1. Rook a to b8, and here white plays very, very powerful move. This is the powerful move that it's not easy to see, but that shows that if white simplifies position, that's what I mentioned, then they will have an advantage, and move is e5. That's a very powerful move, because now Black must take on e5. They must take it with a pawn. Taking with the knight is going to give them very difficult game because rook is going to take on e7 next move. Even after knight c6, knight takes, and rook takes e7. White has big advantage now because f7 is a weakness, and black didn't do anything, didn't activate its pieces enough to justify weaknesses on a file. So this timely shot e5 makes position in white's favor. T takes c, knight f3. White will get the e5 pawn back. After e6, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, knight takes e5, rook c7, has to be protected, and now knight e4. You see, weakening the bishop on d7. And after knight to e4, knight takes e4, knight takes d7, rook d8, and if rook takes e4, so what has happened in this game? White managed immediate activity in its center to distract black from getting quick counterplay on the queen side, because it was just a matter of one tempo, and now white has some advantage. Rook check doesn't bring any results because simply rook e1, and white is better. Winning, I don't know if white is winning, but white has an advantage. So what's the conclusion based on these two games we just looked? Actually, it's more like high-level analysis, more like than a game. So conclusion is this. In the position where black went for pawn damage here, this looks very double-edged. It's like when you start attack on the opposite sides. It's very close. The side that plays better gonna come up on top, unless there is a position where one has huge advantage. Black has legitimate hopes for a counterplay on queen side. White has opportunity to, in the game, rook d1 and rook b8, and then just the way we looked at this game. And side that plays better wins. So when you go for the position, how should you assess whether these double pawns are worth getting or not? You see, if you have legitimate play, you can go for it. And then with the best play, you may get an advantage or some disadvantage. And this how you're going to get experience, because there is no clear way of getting assessment of the position in the very early stage. Of course, there are positions where we're going to get create ourselves pawn structural damage, and it's going to be very bad and very good, and you can see it right away. This one, this position is sophisticated and it looks very close. That's why every tempo is very, very important. And that's why it's so difficult to make an assessment. What happened in this game actually is this e5 move. Now question is, maybe black shouldn't play this way they played, But then you're going to go and search for different continuation, maybe with delaying on knight c4, maybe in this position actually, black played knight c4 first. Another option is to go maybe a5, an a5 move that makes sense, because what do we want to do after a5? We are, in a way, we are threatening a4, and after we deflect this both pieces, knight and bishop, we can take pawn on e4. Position is double-edged, and what I am trying to say, something that may look to you absolutely horrible, this pawn structure. Whether rook is on f1 and pawn on a3, or rook on e1, pawn on a2. It looks horrible no matter which way you look at it. And that's what I'm trying to say. It's not horrible. It's very double-edged, and that's where it's worth to get this terrible pawn structure for good activity of the pieces. It's same like maybe like sacrificing the pawn for this open two files. And the exception is that a pawn may be a very important factor in these types of positions. This is something to explore, something to go deeper, but it's very essential to know that not all pawn damages are critical, pawn structure damages. Now I want to bring you one of my own games played in my relatively young years in 1973. And this game was played against David Bronstein. Well, legend, of course, and one of the best players in the Sicilian defense at that time. That was in Soviet Championship that I won in 73, and I was black. I was extremely aggressive as chess player, and I was playing very frequently for direct attack. So this game is not an exception, and I played for direct attack on my opponent's king, neglecting some damages in pawn structure. Let's see that. And it should have, I won the game with black, but I was very close to losing. And let me see why player of Bronstein's caliber could have slipped in a seemingly winning position. Very well known variation of Sicilian, Queen d2 a6, castle on both sides, no, castle for white, and bishop d7, f4, bishop e7. I don't really want to concentrate on the opening part, knight f3, b5. And there is a move e5, which was not played, very well-known theoretical move, where black plays b4. White must take on f6, because in case knight moves, black is going to have knight e4. So this was not played. After f4 and b5, bishop takes f6. I took with a pawn to keep d6 pawn alive. g3, b4, knight e2, queen b6. Black doesn't really have any weaknesses yet, because this double pawn on f6 is not a weakness, because I explained previously on my pawn structure DVD that this is part of a chain. So after g3, b4, knight e2, queen b6, king b1 was played. Now black castles, long, knight c1, knight goes to b3, king b8, and now white plays f5. Now f5 plan is not a new plan, and it's the only sensible move white can make in this position. What they are trying to do, they are trying to make black play e5, and where bishop will immediately go on this diagonal. But if black doesn't play e5, they want to put maximum pressure on e6 pawn. So in this position, I took on f5 and took on f5. Looks like I just won a pawn. Of course, I didn't do it to win a pawn. I did win pawn, but you see now black has absolutely awful pawn structure. Every black pawn on the board is weak. What black is banking for here is to organize slowly queenside attack using bishop pair. But after bishop takes f5, here queen f4, bishop e6, and knight h4. Now when you have a lot of damaged pawns, your opponent, as a rule, is going to have a lot of outposts for its minor pieces. Knight f5 is coming, and there is no pawn to chase knight away from f5. And if white manages to put some minor piece on d5, bishop, maybe knight, that will have also no black pawn to chase it away. So black has to be extremely active to somehow cover its weaknesses. Knight e5, knight f5. Now, maybe better move was rook e8, but I took on f5, and of course I don't want to play with a bishop on e7 that looks like a pawn, so I went d5. Here I opened my bishop, I have a good knight on e5, and I have possibility of pawn storm and getting the c file. But black's king is also weak, and extra pawn that black has is absolutely meaningless. So let's see what happened. At this point, I actually considered my position very playable. Bishop g2, rook d7, rook e1, rook d8. I want to protect d5 pawn. I really don't want to lose this pawn, although white could have taken on the last move. But if white takes this pawn right away, remember, we are looking for activities. We have powerful knight on e5, and exchange of pieces will be deadly for black because they cannot survive this pawn structure. Now rook d8, and trying to get some activity, possibly rook d2, and on rook d1 maybe queen c5. White is clearly better. White is clearly better, so, but what happened in this game, after bishop g2, rook d7, rook e1, now notice that white is threatening rook takes e5, and if pawn takes, queen takes e5 check, picking up the rook on h8. But rook d8 was part of a plan, queen takes h7. I analyzed this position with Rybka, and, well, position is definitely not good for black. After queen takes h7, I went a5, white went knight d3, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and I went a4. Here I'm trying to create some play on the queen side. h4, a3, h5, and now f5. Of course, this was all idea of playing a4 and a3. At that point, I did realize that I will be happy to make a draw in case white takes and exchanges the queens. On the other hand, black wants to play bishop f6, putting a lot of pressure on dark diagonal. So after f5, queen b3 was played, and now b takes a is a threat. So I took on b2, and rook e3 was played, and I went rook a7. Now I have a counterplay finally. I want to go rook a3, and if black takes on b2, then bishop f6. Or maybe even bishop f6 first. After rook a7, a4 was played. Of course, pawn is immune because queen is hanging. After a4, bishop f6. Now bishop is going to have outpost on c3. b2 pawn is protected, and position is absolutely unclear. Well, after bishop f6, rook e d3 was played, and Bronstein at that point, he was over 50 years old, and it was like young Bronstein. He made few inaccurate moves, and he collapsed quickly. Actually, it's easy to collapse in this position because black has already big initiative. Queen b5, attacking a4 pawn. Of course, queen cannot be taken. And after queen b5, c3, rook a4, and you see the pawn structure is absolutely no factor in this position. And after queen takes b2, very strong move, rook a3, and threatening bishop takes c3. Again, pawn on b4 is immune, so rook takes d5. Actually, after rook a3, this position probably already lost. Well, what are the possible defenses here for black? White tried the most active. Rook takes d5, rook takes d5, and rook takes d5. Queen b6. At this point, I correctly assessed that I'm totally winning. Anytime queen takes b4 now, or even a couple of moves earlier, will be met by rook b3 check, with winning instantly. And here, after queen b6, bishop f1 was played, and now I don't want to take on c3, because that would lead to a draw after queen takes rook and rook b5. Black is going to have an extra pawn in opposite color bishops, which is never going to win. So after bishop f1, king c7, very strong move. King feels very safe on c7. No white piece can reach it. Rook b5, queen e3, and now threats are overwhelming, so white played queen e2, and here's some neat finish after rook a1 check. It's a forced mate, or winning material big time. King has to move. Doesn't matter, he could have moved immediately to b1. It would have been the same position. And finally, bishop g5 ends the game. Well, very interesting game. And if we go back several moves, we see white with overwhelming positional advantage, structural advantage. Well, but what I think here, instead of queen takes h7, what might have been better, that knight d3. And here, how I would advise you to come to conclusion that knight d3 is the best option. If you play here knight d3, you want to eliminate one big strength that black has, is knight on e5. This is one option. Well, the way it went into the game, queen takes h7, a5, and then knight d3, knight takes d3, queen takes d3. This is all okay. On a4, what was played here is h4, just activating the pass pawn. But with opposite color bishops, I don't think pass pawn is going to have big effect. I would go back to queen f5, attacking d5 pawn, not to give black free chance to push the a3 and weaken the king. And now on something like bishop c5, I don't know, white can simply take on d5, or maybe even go rook e8, exchange one set of rooks. Now again, the rook is hanging, pawn is hanging, a4 is hanging, d5 is hanging. It's a very grim position for black. Bishop c5 is a bad move. And on a3, probably, I don't know, maybe just take on d5 any which way, maybe even go b3, because it's not very clear how black is going to bring the queen on this diagonal. Anyway, position was in a way double-edged, and I thought still, shouldn't say double-edged. Black has some chances, but I think white was much, much better. And as in chess, in every type of position, better position doesn't win by itself. You have to play precisely, and precisely white did not play here in this game, and that's what resulted in a crushing attack for black in this game. Well, that teaches us again that pawn structure versus bad pawn structure versus possibility of attack. It's always one of the hardest parts of chess strategy. Number one is assessing. Assessing position is difficult. Number two, you have to keep in mind that time is very sensitive. For example, if side with pawn weaknesses does not create active play quickly, they will be buried with those weaknesses. And on the other side, a side that has a good pawn structure and positional advantage, they have to quickly try to convert it into something very real before your opponent gets dangerous counterplay. So 90% of the time, of course with the exception of very obvious cases, it's double-edged. And when position in chess is double-edged, tempos and preciseness is critical. So that's exactly what happened in this game. Now I want to show you one very interesting game, and I was fascinated by this game and how difficult to assess it. And in the end of the game, I will tell you why it is so instructive. Game was played between two very famous grandmasters, Peter Svidler and Vladimir Kramnik. It was very quiet Petrov defense, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, knight c3, knight takes c3, d takes c. Now, actually, this variation now is maybe the most popular, maybe the second most popular against Petrov defense, where it's known that it's not very easy to get any advantage in Petrov defense for white. So after bishop e7, bishop e3, and bishop e3, castle, queen d2, knight c6, castling, knight e5. This variation is very well known, and it's been played multiple times. h4. It's a rather unusual move. It's not so much to attack, to make an attack on against the black's king, but it's mostly to gain some space on king's side, and I will show you in a little bit what I mean by that. So rook e8, h5, bishop f6, king b1, a6, and now knight h2. Now, white tries to avoid exchange of knights, and try to play bishop e2 and later push g4. Now, let me talk for a little bit about position that could have happened after knight takes f3 and gf. This position, if you compare pawn structure, for example, if you take queens off the board, then all we're going to have that is essential in this position is pawn structure. It's absolutely terrible for white. However, with the queens on the board, this makes very difficult for black to play, because after bishop d3 and rook d1 to g1, white is going to have substantial compensation for pawn damages and possibility for very powerful attack. Kramnik, who likes to give opponent weaknesses and who loves to play against pawn weaknesses, however, decided to play a6. Knight h2, b5, bishop e2, preparing g4, bishop b7, but now f4, and after knight d7, bishop f3. It's very strong bishop black has on b7, and after bishop takes f3, very strong move, pawn takes f3. Finally, white got their wish. They got their wish was to get weaknesses for themselves. Well, in reality, it's they have very strong pressuring position, pressure on king side, pressure in the center. Why I'm naming it as a pressure? Because g5 attack is not going to be successful for white. However, knight on g4, when it gets to g4, which is probably very next move, is going to be the most powerful piece on the board. It's going to be permanently placed on g4 and creating all kinds of inconveniences for black. Now, let's see what happened. Queen e7, knight g4, queen e6, rook d1 to g1, king h8, h6. Obviously, black cannot afford any opening of the G file. So G6, and now rook E1. What just happened? What happened is white decided that they don't want to have kingside attack. Not that they had at any point, but these double pawns are fully compensated for knight on G4 position, and now black has no squares to put their knight. There is always in danger of white going bishop d4 and having problem on diagonal. White has very strong pressure against black's king. So it's interesting that I put this position on Rivka. I did believe, before I did that, I did believe that white has very strong position, and the computer programs that normally value very much weaknesses, and obviously Rivka saw there's a big damage and dent in white's pawn structure. Nevertheless, she evaluated this position as a sizable advantage for white. So after rook e1, black played queen f5 to getting out of the e file, and now bishop d4. Now you see, that's what I liked about this game, the transformation of the positional compensation, transformation of the activity. Here I will tell you what I mean. Bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, pawn f6, and now simply a3 to open look for a king. Now, what I mean by transformation, let's see what would have happened if black played queen c5. If black played queen c5, queen takes c5, you see how you can go to an end game with so many weaknesses. Now, if knight takes, of course, knight takes f6 with a king that cannot move on from h8 is very dangerous for black. And if black decides to take with dc, rook takes e8, rook takes e8, and now rook d1. Black's position is absolutely terrible because after rook e7, actually king c1, this is the kind of a Zugzwang position. And again, the powerful knight on g4 and dominance of d file, the white's position nearly winning. And why? Because there are no moves for black. I think black has to play something like rook f7, well, which is a meaningless move. There are no moves. King cannot play to g8 because of rook takes d7, and if rook takes d7, white simply wins a piece. White has no threats. Oh, let's see what happens after f5. Then knight e5, and more trouble for black because they cannot take this knight because of the checkmate. So rook has to be protecting knight. Knight cannot move because of f6 pawn. King cannot move because of rook takes d7. That means black has no more pieces. How many moves can they make with pawns? This is going to come to an end also. And then there is a total Zugzwang, horrible position for black. And you see, this is a damaged pawn structure, but most powerful pawn on h6 gives white tremendous positional pressure. Actually, this variation is very important. And let me show you once more. Queen takes c5, and knight, if knight takes, after knight takes f6 and knight d5, this position is not pleasant for black at all. And if pawn takes, then rook takes e8, rook takes e8, rook d1. And black's position is very dangerous. We could go b3, or we could go king c1, as I showed before. Now, here is the interesting question we can ask ourselves. How do we know? How did we know, going to this position, that we're going to have enough positional pressure on black to compensate our multiple pawn weaknesses? And the answer is this. Playing with pawn weaknesses and creating for yourself pawn weaknesses in exchange for some kind of a positional compensation is one of the most dangerous aspects of the chess game. So when you go to this pawn endgame, the reason why is this. Not dangerous because you can get crushed or something, no. Dangerous because value of every move is very high. When you have this pressure, if you don't exploit it correctly, then you're going to have nothing but weaknesses and good chance to lose the game. So when you go for those positions, you should do either, if you are very confident that you're going to have this compensation, and then you take an obligation of making some very precise moves. Or you know this position and you know it's good before you went for it because it was part of your preparation. I'm just telling you how important it is. And from the examples that we just saw before, in the first two examples, you saw how one little move can make a difference in double-edged position, whether weaknesses are more important or the initiative. And this game is a great example of it. So after a3, Kramnik did not play queen c5. Apparently he understood and he saw what could have happened, so he played rook e6. Now knight e3. You see, white doesn't want to let black play rook e8 and have some pressure on e-file. So knight e3, and after queen c5, knight d5. Again, black has serious problems. If they take the queen, white takes, and what to do with the e-file? You don't want to take on e1 and have a rook coming to e7. Next move. On the other hand, you cannot double rooks because white is simply going to start exterminating black's pawns. a6, and they're going to have multiple pass pawns. So queen takes queen is not good. Rook e8 was played. Then rook takes c6. Rook takes c6. Queen takes c5. And now after dc, white obviously has big advantage in the endgame. So what happened? Knight takes c7, rook c6, knight e8, king g8, rook d1, knight f8, knight d6. white simply has better piece position and extra pawn. And this extra pawn, 4 against 3 on queen side, is decisive, because when white plays eventually c4, the pawns will get undoubled, and it's inevitable that white will get very strong pass pawn. It's not necessary for us to go to the end of the game, but white won the game. And I think it's very, very strong display of playing with a double pawns, 2 double pawns. And also you see that double pawn on c file for white is not such a big damage, structural damage, but double f pawn, that means both pawns are vulnerable and weak, and weak slash strong h pawn. So maybe very weak, but at this game it proved to be very powerful. Very interesting game. Another example of great play and great assessment. And again, playing with pawn weaknesses, it's always a risk. It's a risk, and sometimes it's a calculated risk. Calculated risk in this case means that we go to the position where we have some weaknesses, but we know this position, it's part of our opening preparation. So let me show you a couple of very interesting examples of calculated risk. So I have in my opening repertoire that I suggest, I have a whole bunch of positions where the game is unbalanced. Unbalanced game means where each side has some kind of advantages, and we have to compare these advantages and these damages from every position. So, and you go for them. I will take a couple of examples from repertoire. For example, 1, e4, c5, knight c3. And you know, there is no opening in a chess, in modern chess theory, that doesn't contain these types of positions, with double-edged positions, that has to do a lot with the pawn structure. f4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop b5. Very well-known position of Grand Prix. d5, ed, a6, knight c3, knight f6, d4, knight takes d5, dc, knight takes c3, queen takes d8, and b takes c. Now, if you have this position as part of your repertoire for white, and you followed my previous DVDs where I try to justify this multiple pawn damages, you will know what we're playing for. But let me point something here. After bishop takes c3, rook b1. This would be extremely dangerous position for white to go for when you don't know this position. But I know this position, and I think most of you should know that too, because you followed the analysis that I was providing in book, on DVDs, and you should know that this position is very, very double-edged. So in this position, It's very hard to have a worse pawn structure than white has now. They have double C pawns, weak C5 pawn. Black has two bishops, no queens on the board. However, white has full compensation for it. King C7, rook B3. King C7 needs to be played to develop the bishop on F5. So, or E6 in this case. Rook B3, bishop F6, bishop D2. I have to point, if black manages to develop light square bishop and take rook from A8 and put it somewhere on E8 or D8, they will have nearly winning position. But here, it's a little bit difficult to do. Bishop E6, bishop A5 check. And black has choices to go king C8 or to go king C6. Well, let's look at king C6. It looks very dangerous to come out early with a king. But again, this is weaknesses versus activity. Every move from now on, from both sides, can be decisive. So, rook b6 check, king takes c5, and in this position, white has only one move that is playable. One move that may be decisive, and second move that may be decisive also. But those two moves will decide the result of the game that may be exactly opposite. Well, let's see. If rook takes b7, after rook takes b7, for example, black has a big advantage. Everything is forced. Rook h to b8, rook c7 check, king b5. Well, rook c7 check because you don't want to exchange rooks. And now all you have is weaknesses. And now black king all of a sudden, from being a target, is very well placed on c5, in the middle of the board, but white does not have enough ammunition to create any harm, any threats to black's king. So white's supposed to play rook c7 check, and after king b5 and bishop c3, simply king b6. Rook is trapped, bishop takes f6, and you know this position is, in my opinion, it's all completely lost for white. White has multiple weaknesses. Bishop is better than knight, b-file, and this how this activity that you had, that we had right here, that's how this activity can absolutely disintegrate, and we're going to get lost position. The critically important move is knight d2. And now black has to make some choices. Knight d2 after, if rook h d8, then knight e4 check, and white simply wins. King d5, this is a forced win for white, and rook d8 does seem like a reasonable move. This is a forced win for white after king d5, knight takes f6. To simplify position, and winning a bishop. You see the rook on d8 is hanging, and rook d1 check doesn't do anything because after rook e1, white simply wins with an extra piece. So rook d8 is a losing move. Now, what about rook b8? On rook b8, we go rook d1. And now, all of a sudden, we are threatening mate in 2. For example, if rook d8, knight e4 check, followed by checkmate. And bishop d5, stopping knight e4, is not going to do any good because after c4, black is completely busted. Because if they go bishop c6, then we can go knight b3 check, king c4, rook b4 check, king c3, and we have, after simply rook d2 move, rook from b4 is going to move, and it's simply going to be total destruction. Black can resign here. So here is the position that seems like so obviously good for white because of bad king on c5. It's not obviously so good because of the limited amount of pieces on the board, make it very sensitive position, and knight d2 is the only move that proves that white is doing well, and rook takes b7 is another opportunity which proves exactly the other way. So that's how sensitive these positions are. But we can go for it because it was all completely, entirely analyzed, and it was proved there is no danger. It's a calculated risk. Calculated risk, that means it looks risky. We calculated it, and we came to the conclusion that it's good for us. This is the advantages of preparation. Otherwise, it's very difficult to go for this position if you don't know it. And now look at a different continuation. Well, we played here bishop d2, and after bishop e5 check, what about king c8? What do we get? We don't get now attack on black's king. How can we justify our pawn structure damage? So what we're going to have to do here is to go rook b6. Now we're threatening to go c6. Well, for example, if bishop takes, even c6 is very powerful because black's king is going to be walking all over the board now. Now, this is one option, and the other option is simply to go rook d1. They are both very, very powerful. So black, suppose, wants to prevent c6 and go bishop d5. Then we go rook d1, attacking the bishop on d5. And now look at this pawn structure. Possibly, I don't know, can you voluntarily construct any worse pawn structure for white? It's going to be very hard if you can. However, white is completely winning. White is completely winning because, well, rook d8 is not possible because black simply loses material. It's a check. But if rook d8 you cannot play, suppose you go e6, then we simply retreat the rook. Now there is no rook d8, and even if you go bishop d8, trying what white is trying to do to put bishop on b6 and rook on d3. Even after bishop d8, if we go bishop b6, you see that this position is totally resignable because white is going to penetrate with both rooks, with a rook c3 check, rook c7, and it's going to be unbearable for black to play the end game with a rook down. That's what is happening here. So this position, with incredible weaknesses for white, is very powerful. Concrete assessment of position. If somebody gave you this position and they asked me, quickly assess who is better, you may say black, because first thing that you see in the position is the pawn structure of both sides. Black has perfect pawn structure, white has worst imaginable, and position is lost for black. This is very instructive observation and another instructive position for you to learn from. Now I want to see a couple of positions again from our repertoire. It's Scotch Gambit. And in Scotch Gambit, very frequently, the pawn structure is the key of whole opening. Bishop c4. The position I'm talking to you is about after knight takes, well, this position. Well, in this position, black can, as we know, go bishop d7 or bishop c5. Well, let's look at both of them. Now, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, pawn takes, we castle. And one of the possible moves here is b. Then we go f3, knight g5, f4, and after knight e4, notice that knight e6 will be met by f5. This is something I analyzed on DVD multiple times. So after knight e4, we have to make a decision. We're going to have potentially good attack on king side. But there is one piece that is kind of on the way of our attack, knight e4. It's a very strong piece, and here is very weak piece, knight on b1. We want to exchange those knights. Do we exchange by playing knight d2? And do we exchange this knight by playing knight c3? Knight d2 does not double our pawns, and that gives us perfect pawn structure, and knight c3 doubles our pawns, and we have now doubled pawns. However, decision is this: knight c3 is by far the strongest move on the board here in this position. Well, because double pawns, pawns on c2 and c3 are much better than pawns on c2 and b2. Because, well, just to show you how strong this is, we're going to go knight b3, and after c4, knight d4, and after c5, knight e2. And this is practically winning position for white. Now, question you may ask, why did we go knight b3 and then knight d4 and then knight e2 and not immediately knight e2. No, you don't want to go knight e2 immediately, because black may play bishop b5 and exchange this bad bishop for our knight that we can use later in attack. So that's why we go knight b3. Now bishop b5 doesn't really do anything. We can go rook f3 and use this rook in attack on a black's king. So you see that this position is very bad for black. The 5 pawn is hanging, f6 is coming, and we know it, and knight g3 is coming, where knight g3 followed by queen g4, well, here is going to get our position almost like automatic win. So many pieces attacking black's king. Now, let's see the difference in the position if we played knight d2. Now, knight takes d2, bishop takes d2. Now you see c5, knight b3, c4, and after knight d4, again c5, and d4. What happened now? Black is going to play after f5, bishop c6, followed by queen d5, and all of a sudden they have a great position because they have no intentions of castling kingside. And this was not possible if we played the way we did. We need b2 pawn on c3 and use these doubled pawns as the stoppers for black's pawn chain. You see, d4 is not coming now, which means this light square bishop cannot be activated. d5 is hanging. There is no d4, we're just simply going to take it. So that's how big of a difference it is in a pawn structure. So we doubled pawns for very concrete reason, and we justified it. So this is very difficult, if not lost position for black. So in this position is nearly impossible for black to get a reasonable play. So now I want to show you a different position, a little bit different. Here, instead of bishop d7, black plays bishop c5. Now we go bishop e3, and now they go bishop d7, bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, and now again we have choices to go knight c3 or knight d2. The only correct decision is knight d2, because if you go knight c3, you're going to get double pawns on c-file, and you do not have that powerful attack potentials on the king side that you had in a previous example. So, which means black is going to castle and probably blow up the center by going f6, or maybe even queen e7 followed by f6. White does not have time to go f4 and f5. So what in the first example was very good for white in the previous, in this second example, it's very bad. The correct move is knight d2, because in this position now white does not play for kingside attack. What they're going to do, they're going to play for dark square blockade of c5 and d4 squares, which makes white's position much, much better. Knight goes to c5, then bishop to d4, and white is going to have big advantage. So suppose black plays on d2, queen e7. That makes white's try to create blockade on dark squares very difficult. So, but white has, again, this is all about pawn structure. Now we do this, knight takes c4, pawn takes c4, and this tactical shot gives white huge advantage. It's all about pawn structure again. Bishop cannot take on e6 because amazingly black loses a piece after knight takes e6. They just lost the bishop because if pawn takes e6, queen h5 check, followed by queen takes c5. Okay. Queen cannot take on e6 because bishop is hanging. That leaves only bishop takes e3, which also loses a piece because knight takes g7 check, followed by knight f5, and bishop on e3 is loose because queen b4 check doesn't do anything, and so is bishop takes f2 because king takes f2, and on queen c5 check, simply knight e3. White has an extra piece and absolutely winning. So what black has to play, and it's the only move, pawn takes e6. And now, very simple tactical shot, knight takes c6. You see, we're using tactical shots to get positional advantage. Queen is hanging, bishop takes, queen h5 check, and queen takes c5. Now, you want to compare the pawn structure, you will see dramatic difference. Black has 4 terribly weak pawns, a7, c7, e6, e4. White has none. So e3 will be met by f3, and e3 pawn is lost. Although this is opposite color bishop position, white's king will go to e3, and these multiple weaknesses in the hands of a good technical player will bring them a win. Well, we cannot just dedicate any time to analyze this particular position. In a conclusion to this DVD, I want to tell you this. Pawn weaknesses subject is the kind of a subject that is very difficult to assess, because when there are pawn weaknesses and the other side has absolutely nothing to show for it, like this particular position, then it's obvious. But sometimes the other side has some piece play activity, some king side attack, or some potentially pass pawn. Well, in these cases, it's difficult to assess, so you have to use your own judgment. And, well, one of the medicines for a good judgment is experience, and the other medicine that I know of look at the games of strong players. And in either case, the value of particular move is very, very important. And it has to be played precise, and in a way it puts pressure on you to play precisely. Well, on the other hand, it puts pressure on your opponent too. As you see, no matter in what angle we look at it, it's double-edged. So if you are confident, you should go for this type of positions, and it will make you definitely will make you a better chess player. Thank you.